Welcome to ILTV's special online panel, Combating the Conflict, Addressing Misinformation and the Rise in Anti-Semitism. I'm Emmanuel Kadosh, and joining me today in the studio are Mazzig, op-ed writer and senior fellow at the Tel Aviv Institute, and Rudy Rochman, Jewish Israel rights activist. Now on Zoom, we have the founder of the Jewish Fashion Council and Me for We project, Adi Heyman, Israel advocate and influencer Moti Ankari, and high-tech partnerships manager and social media influencer Shir Ibgi. Moti and Adi are both joining us from New York. Shir lives here in Israel, and of course, Rudy and Chen are here in our studios in Tel Aviv. Now, let's get into it. Over the last 2 weeks, month, the intense social media exposure over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been taken to new heights, with people from all over the world voicing their opinions on the issue, as well as constantly sharing or resharing relevant articles and posts. All of this, in turn, has caused an uproar of anti-Semitic attacks against Jews all over the globe, including verbal and physical attacks in Europe, North America, and the Middle East since the escalation between Israel and Gaza heated up earlier this month. Now, I wanted to unpack this a little bit and hear from each one of our guests their opinions on the matter. Guys, thank you so much for joining me, and of course, everyone on Zoom. Let's just even the playing field a little bit. Not all of us are as super well-versed as you guys on the conflict, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. People who have been sharing their opinion on social media aren't as well-versed as we would like, and we've seen that become and cause a very big issue. So I kind of just want you guys to take this as more of like an opportunity to educate, share your opinion, share with us, facts and how you guys are feeling about everything that's been going on. So we're going to start with you, Rudy. We have a few questions, both from the people that are viewers and avid ILTV followers, and of course, ourselves. So let's start things off by talking about how social media has had a direct impact on how people across the world saw this specific escalation between Israel and Gaza unfold. And what do you think about that?
Sure. So social media is a tool. It could be used for the good. It could be used for the bad. It's a tool to disseminate information. A lot of Jews, a lot of people that are pro-Israel are very surprised to the fact that there's so much out there against Israel, against the Jewish people. But it's something that a lot of activists that have been doing this for a long time, I've realized that this is what the society is at right now. And social media is just a representation or a mirror into what the society truly looks like. Now, there are two problems: the role of the people that aren't part of this land, that are not Palestinian, that are not Israeli, and also the role of the people of this land. And if you're outside of this land, meaning you're someone that's pro-Palestinian or pro-Israel, it's your responsibility to use in whatever measures that you can, whether in social media or in your activism or in any energy, to use that to bring people together. There's no reality where Palestinians disappear. There's no realities where Israelis disappear. And all these narratives being pushed on social media is always this side is correct and this side is wrong. This side is the oppressor and this side is the oppressed. These are the people that we should be supporting and these are the people we should be against. But the reality is, if we keep pushing that narrative, you're only going to be destructive to both sides, because neither are going to disappear. So we have to talk about the suffering that is going on. We have to change the structure, because clearly there's something that's wrong that's happening here. But the role that they're playing is pushing these zero-sum game narratives. And who's really profiting from this? It's definitely not the Israeli people.
Right.
It's definitely not the Palestinian people. So who's profiting? If not the media companies, weapon industries, or even politicians that are using this to get political gain within their following, or not to have elections on the Palestinian Authority side. So we have to ask ourselves, who's really profiting and why this is happening? Not just the what, but the why. And that's something that a lot of people miss. Now, in terms of the Jewish community, we have to realize that this has been going on for over 15 years.
Right.
Movement on campuses, intellectual spaces, trying to get the next generation's political and intellectual class to hate the Jewish people and to see Israel as the representation of everything bad in the world. And you see this from the left to the right. The right usually blames the Jewish people for the source of the problem of a society. So blame coronavirus on the Jews, blame the Black Plague on the Jews, blame the economic situation post-World War I in Germany on the Jews. But the left does something a little bit different. They take what their society is ashamed of, so white supremacy, apartheid, genocide, slavery, colonialism, and they blame those elements that they feel ashamed of their ancestors onto the Jews. And you see those same words being applied to the Jews. And the reality is that, one, we're not foreigners. We come from this land. You dig in the land, you find our history. And yes, there's a conflict where both the Jewish leaders and the Palestinian leaders got it wrong, and they didn't come together, and they fought in the war, and they were manipulated, of course, by other powers. But now when you have come to a point where we need to have conversations of moving forward, and the Jewish people need to realize that this problem is only going to get worse if we don't rise up, if we don't start taking our control over our narrative. You wouldn't want to hear about black rights from KKK members. You wouldn't want to hear about women's rights from misogynists. So why are, when you go to college campuses or intellectual spaces, the only people generating the conversation about Israel and the Jewish people are those that are against us?
What's interesting, we were talking about this obviously with both of us here in the studio, less so with the Zoom members, but This isn't a new topic. Just because it's, being a little bit a lot more exposed on social media doesn't mean that it's a new topic. It might be a new topic to a few people who have seen it being exposed on social media, but how do you see, you were saying that social media is a tool, but how do you see that it's been impacting people negatively? How does it impact Israel negatively in the last 2 weeks?
I mean, the numbers of the people that are spreading this misinformation and the lies about Israel and about the Jewish people are huge. I mean, we mentioned two supermodels, Bella Hadid and Gigi Hadid, which, I don't know, we will discuss it later, but I don't think that they should be our target because they're supermodels and they're not thought leaders in any way. We'll discuss it later, but they do have millions of followers. They have more followers than Jews alive in the world. We have, 14 million Jews, and just one of them has 44 million. So I think that the problem is that really those people are spreading a lot of misinformation, and someone told me that I'm gatekeeping on the conversation when I'm saying that people that are not experts shouldn't take such a stand. And I stand behind it because I do think that there should be some sort of gatekeeping. People that until 2 weeks ago did not know how to say Sheikh Jarrah or how to pronounce names of villages, that now they're talking about them as if they're experts and claiming that there is ethnic cleansing and talking about colonialism and imperialism without knowing that, understanding the meaning of those words. Or I was doing a live stream with one of the drag queens from RuPaul Drag Race yesterday, Alexis Michelle, and Alex told me that he feels that he's so uneducated about it, and we, I found that there was a lot of misunderstanding, and that once they are open up to having those conversations and researching more, that it will be much better. And I think I was telling Rudy when we came on the elevator that I used to write op-eds. My op-eds were in LA Times, in NBC News, everywhere. Now I'm focusing more on making infographics on Instagram. And I know it's ridiculous. I've never thought that this would get me more of a reach and people will really listen to what I have to say. But, Deborah Messing is sharing my messages. People that are with high profile are sharing my content now, but it's just infographics. When I wrote articles, people did not even listen to them.
Now, I want to ask Moti, what do you feel has been the biggest misinformation that has been circling around that you would like to either set straight or kind of talk about? I know that you are coming to us from New York, and you guys are kind of getting like a different outlook on things. So talk to me.
I think there's a lot of misinformation right now, just people not contextualizing the whole situation. So people are saying, like, for example, people think that Israel attacked the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Right. They don't understand that there was rioters. They don't understand that there were people, provoking the soldiers. They think that Israel just woke up one morning and they were bored and they decided to go into the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Like, that's what genuinely people think. Right. That's the crazy part. Like, people that I'm friends with, people that I follow, peers, colleagues, like, that's what they think. So I did a live with Rudy actually the other day, and I think just debunking the timeline and just explaining to people what actually happened and how it happened and what led to it was really important. There's just at this point, so much has happened in 2 weeks. It feels like I'm going to need to do like 15 lives just to get through everything. It's difficult because even after you tell and explain to people, they're still convinced. They don't want their minds to change, which is very, very scary.
Well, I think a lot of people are very set in their ways, and obviously each person believes that they know the most and they know the correct information and they have the best opinion. And now with social media, they share their information or what they believe is right and run with it, and they don't realize how many people are following them, how many people are influenced by that. And speaking of influence, let's talk a little bit about social media influencers and celebrities sharing their opinions and taking sides on the matter. Shir, how do you feel about this, and how do you think that that's impacted people around the world?
I mean, personally, like, I've been sharing, just facts and numbers. And again, I think it's great that Chen is starting to create infographics because that's how people like to read information very quickly. We'll post, the truth. And even though it's a really long article, they'll read the first few sentences and then reshare it. But I'm sure that many people that saw, let's say, Bella Hadid's infographic, I'm sure they just read the first slide and then just reshared it as well and didn't read the entire thing. And that's something that, we're seeing happening a lot. And that's really, spreading the misinformation because people are click happy. That's what I like to call it, right? They see something quickly and they share it. Now, for me personally, when I go ahead and, take that stance and share everything that I'm experiencing here in Tel Aviv, I shared, the multiple times I had to run into the bomb shelter. I shared multiple times seeing rockets from my balcony and the Iron Dome, destroying it midair. I had so many friends and followers reach out to me wow, I can't believe, you're sharing this. This is not what I'm seeing at all. I had no idea rockets were even reaching Tel Aviv. I had no idea that this was happening. I can't put, just people were sending me messages as if this was the first time they were seeing the information I was sharing. And that was a scary.
Sorry to cut you off, but that's so interesting that you say that, because so many people who are following, Shir and I happen to have very similar followers, because we're both, Americans here living in Israel. And a lot of people are like, wow, that's so not what we're getting from America. That's not what we're hearing on the news. That's not what we're seeing on social media. Like, we're living in, New York, Miami, wherever it is, and we're not seeing what you guys are experiencing on the day-to-day. And like, tell me about your experience living here in Israel, but also trying to cater to your followers in America and trying to explain to them your experience.
I mean, it's been hard. I get a lot of messages that are not so nice.
Yeah.
And I do my best to just share the facts and share what I'm experiencing. Because at the end of the day, if someone has a stance and they're not open to hearing, the truth and what your side is and whatever it may be, then there's not much more you can do. And for me, I've been really grateful that I've had the followers that did reach out to me saying, can you explain to me what's happening at Sheikh Jarrah? Can you explain to me what this means? Because I don't really know, and you're actually there, and I would like to hear your opinion. And that's what the most heartwarming thing for me, because just to change one person's mind, and to just share your side with one person is the biggest difference. And that's really been the thing that's been keeping me going in the past few weeks.
Adi, I want to ask you to talk a little bit about how you deal with the media, engaging both with people online and in the streets. You're coming to us from New York. Is there, a lot of people have been saying, like, is there even a point to be sharing our opinion or to be sharing these, articles and infographics and all these things? Have you had success in changing the minds of, your followers?
Well, sorry. I think for my following who follow me, they probably have created for themselves this type of echo chamber of social media accounts they follow. So I feel like a huge problem in the sharing of information and having impact and reach is that the people seeing all the, pro-Israel information, anti-Palestine, whatever it is, you typically create your own space, and it kind of reiterates your values, reiterates your views, and therefore eliminates any type of outside information. And I think that's a huge issue with social media, particularly when we're seeing censorship, bias censorship, lack of, regulation, accountability from big tech. So, I mean, it's a big fear that, yes, my following sees what I'm posting, but I don't think they're really the ones that we need to get to. You flip to a different account where, you're retargeted for the boots you buy, you're retargeted for your beliefs. And that's the game of social media. So a lot of people aren't seeing the information. And I think as an influencer or a person with a following, we have to figure out how to reach and get this information to everyone so that they have the ability for themselves to choose and believe based on real facts. And right now we're seeing this effort to create a false moral equivalence between Israel, a democracy, and Hamas, a terrorist organization. And that's just not in balance. And the fact that's being entertained, even perpetuated by leaders, it's disinformation at its worst. I mean, Israel is damned if they fight back and annihilated if they don't. So I think for me and my following are feeling like getting the message across. It's really showing up at rallies, joining with community, creating a presence, pushing our leaders. Mayor de Blasio tweeted out saying we need to push back against anti-Semitism in the street. NYPD is now putting up faces of pro-Palestinian rioters who are causing violence in our streets, a lot of fear here. I know Moti and I were at the rally last week in Times Square, which was a shock to see happen in our city like this. So I think it's hard to see us having impact when everybody is seeing their own feeds, being fed what they want to see, running with that belief. And this year, more than ever, we've seen a call to performative activism. And when we start up the show, we were saying everybody feels like they need to get up and speak and say when they're not educated.
Right.
And I mean, I myself am not as educated. I converted to Judaism. I do have that history, but I'm learning, and I'm learning with organizations, and I just think, we've got to get out of our own heads, our own space, our own social media, and look at things objectively, and that's the goal I have. And
right.
I think we have to keep showing up for it.
That brings up a really interesting point. And I was talking to some friends and the producer here before, how I feel like we have not had conversations with friends at dinners, wherever you go, in the last month that have not involved this topic, that have not been like, did you read this article? Did you sign this petition? Did you hear about this? Did you see this? Like, it has become more of a topic of conversation, especially with maybe a younger crowd, 20s to even 30s, where it's like before we maybe wouldn't have been speaking about this at dinners and parties and at the beach hanging out or whatever it is. And it's become such a topic of discussion, and everyone shares their opinions. And I have a lot of friends that fight back on their DMs and their Instagram comments or whatever it is. Do you see that there is a point in doing that? I want to ask you, Rudy, I know that you have a really big following, and I'm sure you get a lot of pushback on things that you post. Do you respond to everybody that pushes back?
Absolutely. I engage with everyone because at the end of the day, we're all human beings. No one is doing something because they think they're doing the wrong thing. They think that it's doing the right thing, even if it may be the wrong thing. So I think that engaging with them, giving them more of a holistic understanding on the situation, where you can absolutely be pro-Palestinian. You can absolutely criticize certain policies or certain things and being able to fight, but it's not by being against. And I think that we need to step out a little bit from the problem for a second and understand why we even got here in the first place. Let's study another group of people, for example, women or people of color in America. If we go back 70, 80 years ago, they didn't have equal rights in America. What got it that today, 70, 80 years later, there's still a ton of work to do, but we've gotten to a point where our generation, who's been born with this reality, see the idea of people because of their skin color or because of their gender not having equal rights as something ridiculous. There's clearly been a shift in culture with younger generation, and eventually that younger generation growing into political power and changing pop culture and getting people to understand, and eventually they made those changes. But people had to rise up. Black people fought for their rights. Women fought for their rights. Of course, they had allies, but they led their rights in moving forward. And what did the Jewish students do on college campuses and intellectual spaces? They usually shy away. Right now, we have a conflict. Right now, there's on social media. Right now, it's viral. So people are getting involved. But when this dies down, when this settles down, everyone is going to go back to their lives and pretend it's not an issue. And it's just going to get worse in 3-4 years when it comes back up. So it's time for us to be able to narrate our story, us to be able to shift that culture, and especially targeting the younger generation. And even speaking to people that are, the most hateful that you can experience, that you think they're completely against your other side, show them that there's another way to be pro-Palestinian, or those that are pro-Israel and anti-Palestinian. There's another way to be pro-Israel. You shouldn't be anti-either population, because if you're anti-either, you're anti-both. So we need to create new conversation and be able to lead that conversation.
How do you think, more specifically with the rise of anti-Semitism in America, how do you think that social media has impacted that as of recently? As of the last week or 2 weeks, we've been seeing crazy videos online and unbelievable things happening in Europe, in America, in New York, in Los Angeles, right next door to people's homes that we're friends with, and up until that happened, a lot of those people weren't speaking up, weren't sharing their opinions, weren't giving their insight because they were afraid to be judged by their friends. They were afraid to, take a stand and pick a side and share their opinions because they didn't know how their non-Jewish friends would respond to it. And now that it's happening next door to them, all of a sudden they're a little bit more vocal, and they're noticing, like you guys said before, that this isn't new. This is just something that's being seen a little bit more now. And how do you think social media has really impacted that and brought the numbers to anti-Semitic attacks on a crazy, crazy level?
Yeah, almost 500% increase in a week. It's a really good question, because there is a direct impact, and I'll touch on it in a second. I just want to connect to what Rudy just said. It is important that Jewish people will lead the fight for Jewish rights, and it is important that Jewish people will be the ones to define anti-Semitism and not allow people to say that what happens in Israel has nothing to do with anti-Semitism in the West, because it absolutely does. And just like we said, there's a reason that the numbers of attacks are going higher, and anti-Zionists are the ones that are, anti-Israel voices are the ones that are saying, we shouldn't connect Israel and Jewish, and we shouldn't connect anti-Semitism, and they are the ones that are apologizing for anti-Semitism, and the situation is just getting worse. And what happened to Jews when they face ethnic cleansing? we go back to Israel, like my family, like our families all came here. And I think that beside being the ones that are leading the conversation and leading the fight, which we should, we have to focus on creating more allies. And I'm coming more from the progressive side of the political map, more on the left. I'm working with different minority communities. And I think that for me, the most important thing that I'm doing on my social media is to try and get allyship and to speak up for trans rights and to speak up for black rights and to be anti-racist with everything I'm doing. And I think that we can't expect, and I see it a lot on my Instagram, Jewish people coming to me and saying, well, why isn't Black Lives Matter standing up with us? And why isn't LGBTQ people are standing up with us? And it's valid. Why don't they? And I'll tell you why they're on the other side, because the Palestinian side and the anti-Israel side, rather than Palestinians, has been there. And there was anti-Zionist Jews that were part of Black Lives Matter from the beginning. They were sitting in the planning tables and working with this community on developing the platform of Black Lives Matter. So we can't be shocked that 2 years, 5 years later, there's protests in the streets for Black Lives Matter, and people are, vandalizing synagogues. I mean, we should absolutely condemn it, and there's no excuse for it. But I'm saying this is why it happened, because we weren't there. And we need to be part, and we need to show allyship, and that's the only way that we can. Israel can't send IDF soldiers to New York, and we can't protect Jews. We will always be the place for them to come back to. But for Jewish people in the diaspora, which are, as you said, like social media is impacting them. What happens on social media, what Bella Hadid is posting, is not really, it's not why Hamas is shooting rockets. So it's not really impacting Israeli civilians. Who is being the butt of these attacks are the diaspora Jewish community that are being held accountable for the decisions of Netanyahu and the right-wing government that they have nothing to do with, which, by and large, American Jews, over 70% of them, are democratic and are critical of Netanyahu's government. So I think, and I'm not blaming Netanyahu for the anti-Semitism. I'm not blaming. It's really
a cycle of I'm not blaming this person, I'm not blaming this person, but social media brings this out where it's like you pick and choose the people that either have the biggest following and are saying the right or wrong thing or something you don't agree with, and you're kind of just like, Bella Hadid, like, how are you informed enough to be sharing your opinions? Are you, well versed on this topic? Like, can you be sharing these? A lot of people, and especially people that I see on social media, are like, you were talking about the LGBTQ community, the Black Lives Matter movement and things like that. Like, where are those people standing up for Israel? We are, the only country in the Middle East that welcomes with open arms the LGBTQ. We have one of the biggest pride parades in the world that's happening. Yet a lot of that people in that community are not voicing their opinion, and standing up for Israel. And I actually think that's a very interesting topic, especially in New York, which is why I want to kind of shift to.
We don't even stand up for ourselves. You expect other people to stand up for us. You go to college campuses or anywhere today, most Jews are silent. Most Jews put their heads down. So if we start standing up for ourselves, maybe other people will. And absolutely, we need to build coalitions. But it starts by empowering ourselves first. Yeah, because minority communities stand up with each other when you see that a minority group is standing up for itself. I wouldn't want to support a group that can't even stand up for themselves. Because why? The next thing that they will do is to backstab me if they're backstabbing their own people. So I think it's absolutely right.
Well, first of all, I want to let the people on Zoom know that you guys can jump in whenever you want if you guys have anything to say or anything to add. But before I let you guys talk really quickly, I wanted to ask you, you were saying we can't expect other people to stand up for us. We have to stand up for ourselves. Do you have any advice for people that, maybe are afraid to stand up for their community, afraid to stand up in light of everything that's going on, especially anti-Semitic attacks? People are scared,
Yeah. I mean, first of all, look at the education. Let's take the diaspora Jews, for example. The communities that we're a part of, Jewish day schools, the camps, the synagogues, the homes, everything, they teach us how to be Jews in theory and not in practice. They teach us how to put tefillin, light the candles, do the Passover Seder, but they don't teach us how to narrate our story, how to speak to an audience, how to debate, how to communicate, how to create coalitions, how to understand the counter-narratives against us, how to deal with anti-Semitism. In fact, when most students go to college campuses that have a lot of anti-Semitism, the parents tell them, don't get involved, don't respond to your teacher, get the good grade, eventually get the good job, and eventually we'll give back. And that's not the way that Jews survive in this world. That's actually the same formula that has happened everywhere. And for me, I realized this when I started university at UCLA. I realized that there was this wave of anti-Israel, anti-Semitism, blaming all the struggles and all the problems and all the conflicts onto the Jewish people. And I started looking within, what are we doing about it? And the responses that I got were the same things that Jews were saying prior to the Shoah, prior to the Inquisition, prior to everything is, Don't worry about it, it'll just go away. If you do something, it'll just get worse. No, we have to side with the power, and maybe then they'll change everything. But the reality is it starts with us. So if you go to a college campus today, for example, because that really represents the future political class, because usually those that will be politicians and media are coming from those spaces, and someone says something anti-black, the teacher, the students, everyone rises up against it, and definitely the black students stand up against it. If someone says something LGBTQ+ against them, or against women, or against any groups, people rise up. If someone says something against Israel or the Jewish people, no one says anything, and neither do the Jews, for the most part. So if we start standing up for our own rights, educating the next generation to know how to stand up and what that means, and then create coalitions, then we can see a change. A change is not going to come in the short term. It's going to come in the long term, but we need to start putting in the work right now, or else we'll see things get a lot worse than they are right now.
Moti, do you have anything to add, anything to say? Especially, you and Adi are coming to us from New York. You guys, were there with the Black Lives Movement, like all of that's been happening and going on. And how do you feel about that?
I mean, it's definitely strange because, I've stood up for Black Lives Matter, Stop Asian Hate. I was there with my friends, and, I showed support both in person for protesting and both on social media. And I'm not expecting them to support me. It's not like tit for tat. It's not just like, oh, let's, I was there for you. Why aren't you there for me? But I kind of feel like a lot of my friends and a lot of my peers haven't even reached out to ask or to learn or to, and if they did, they would tell me basically oh, this is too complicated. I don't know what to believe. And meanwhile, I'm your friend. Why don't you listen? Why don't you ask me questions? Why don't you tell me what you feel, and I could tell you exactly in the most unbiased way that I can. But people aren't open to it. There's this move. Also, what's really important to note is that the Palestinian movement is hijacking all these other minorities, all these other minority movements, and they are kind of relating it, and they're basically saying it's the same exact situation for Palestinians, but it's not, because when Black Lives Matter happened, it's basically, are you racist or you're not racist? It's not one or the other. It's obviously you're not racist, so you have to speak up for them. And here in this situation, it's a little bit more complicated because there's so much layers, and there's politics, there's religion, there's territory, there was wars, and people don't know the full story. There's no context. So people are oh, they're getting kicked out of their homes, and no one knows why they're getting kicked out of their homes, but it looks like Israel is just walking in and taking land. So people are oh, okay, I'm going to side with them because they're this is what's happening, this shouldn't be happening. So it's kind of really complicated having those conversations. And another thing that I've noticed is a lot of Jews are obviously siding with the Palestinian side because they don't agree with Netanyahu's policies. And also, it's just strange to me seeing a lot of Jews who aren't in Gaza talking about it. Meanwhile, there's Palestinians in Israel talking about the conflict. And whose opinion are you going to trust? Someone who's on, I'm not saying the opposing team, because there's no opposing team. Everyone's on the same team. We want peace. We want to coexist. But someone who is Palestinian living in Israel, or someone who is Jewish living in LA in the Beverly Hills apartment,
right,
not knowing what's going on. So who are you going to trust? So it's really interesting seeing that narrative. And obviously, just like Rudy said, it's important to engage with these people and kind of have these conversations in the most respectful manner, and just not even trying to convince them, just stating facts and telling them that this isn't the solution. Israelis aren't leaving, Palestinians aren't leaving. This is something that we have to focus on and find a solution together, because at the end of the day, one of them's not leaving. We're all staying together.
Right. Adi, I wanted to ask you, how do you think that, if people in America, your followers, whoever it is, who may be Jewish or not Jewish, how can they help, whether it's educating, how can they help Israel at this time? What's your take on that?
I think they have to just stand up for what they believe is right. I mean, we're seeing people scared, like you said, to show up to rallies, or scared to even show up for their Judaism, because for whatever reason, the media has chosen not to push a pro-Israel, pro-Jewish perspective. It's a pro-Palestinian, it's anti-Israel in a lot of cases, even within our government. And I think, this is having a big effect, and people are feeling a lot of fear. But ultimately, I think we have to keep showing up, no fear. if we cower and we're quiet, things will continue as is. This is not a new fight. You know, we marched for peace in New York in 2019. No hate, no fear. We're having rallies this week for it. Obviously, it's escalated, and the situation in Israel has impact here. But I would just say people need to speak up, just like we did for other communities. And I think we need to call out the media for choosing sides and really lending themselves to creating this fear that people do not want to voice if they're pro-Israel, but are actively standing up pro-Palestinian. And it's just, as Mazzig said, we need to come together on this. This is not a them or us. This is, we need a solution that works for everyone. Nobody wants Palestinians, you know, under the plight, under a regime of iron-fisted terrorism. I mean, nobody would want that. I mean, Israelis, 21% of people in Israel are Arabs. I mean, we've seen through COVID them work together, Arab doctor, Israeli doctor, hand in hand in the hospitals. And to now see this narrative be taken by global media and shifted, I say shame on them. And I think people have to stand up, use their voice. I do not condone violence. I think you have to be smart, but I do think where there's a will, there's a way, and where you put your energy, you give life. And we need to light this up more and be inclusive. And like I said, no fear. You know, we've seen anything this year show up loud and proud,
Definitely.
simplicity. So
I want to ask Shir your opinion on, do you feel like anti-Zionist is anti-Semitic? Do you feel like that's a valid statement? Do you think that people that believe in that Jews have the right to have, the state of Israel, or don't have the right to have the state of Israel is anti-Semitic? And how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely believe that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic. I mean, to take a step back for a second, I think the scariest thing to me is the global spread of political polarization. This is happening in the US, it's happening all across Europe, and the growth of the extremists on both sides, on both ends of the political spectrum, is very dangerous because not only are both ends anti-Zionist, but there's a lot of anti-Semitic sentiment behind what they're saying. And it's contributing a lot to the rise of anti-Semitism globally, and it's creating a very difficult environment for Jews to feel comfortable and safe in around the world. And it really feels like at one point that, okay, so now both ends are saying, Israel doesn't have the right to exist, or, free Palestine. And again, right, you have to ask them, what does that mean, free Palestine to you? Because it could be different things. So that's another topic as well. But yeah, it's scary because I have a lot of friends that reach out to me saying, I do support Israel. I feel like Israel does, I do believe Israel has the right to exist, but I don't know what to respond to people that message me on social media also saying, but what about this? What about Palestine? And that's another thing that I wanted to say. Rudy was saying earlier, we're pushing this narrative of one side against the other when it shouldn't be that. And like he said as well, we're not all educated, and not many people are able to stand up for their political opinion. And that's something that, we really have to help everyone. And I even tell my followers that reach out to me, I want to post something, but I'm scared of the response. I say, post what you feel comfortable with. If you get a response you don't know how to answer, I'll help you answer it. And I think that's the baby steps I think we should take to help spread information and educate everyone. But yeah, to answer your initial question, I do believe that. I think there's a lot of anti-Semitism behind the anti-Zionist movement. There's been anti-Semitism around the world for thousands of years.
Right.
People are using Israel now as an excuse to now to redirect their anti-Semitic and that's really what I see happening. And yeah, that's just answer your question.
Rudy?
Yeah, so I think there's an additional layer to that. Let's first define the terms, because a lot of people define themselves as anti-Zionist, and they're using the term Zionism very differently. So whenever I'm engaging with someone, I ask them, okay, well, what do you define as Zionism that makes you anti? And they usually say, well, I'm against the occupation, I'm against the conflict, I'm against the suffering of Palestinians. And I was like, okay, well, if that's what Zionism meant, I also would be against it. However, it's not up to you to define what Zionism is. It's up to the Jewish people. Zion comes from Jerusalem. It's Zion in Hebrew. Zionism means the right for the Jewish people to self-determine on their ancestral land. land. Now, why is that anti-Semitic? Because if you were against the Tibetans' right to return to Tibet, that is a form of being anti-Tibetan. If you're against the Native Americans' rights to their land, the Native Canadian rights to their land, against the Maori's rights to self-determine or to have a relationship to their land, that is a form of being anti those people. If you're against the black people's rights to civil rights, that is a form of being anti those people. There are many layers of anti-Semitism. You can believe like Hitler that all Jews should be killed. You can believe that all Jews should be kicked out. You can believe that Jews should have different rights. And you can believe that Jews should not be disempowered and cannot live in their land. And that is a form of being anti our people. So it's like, I like the Jews, but when they're weak and when they're in diaspora, when they're not strong. But all of a sudden, when they're strong and when they're home and when they want the same standard that all other indigenous peoples want, which actually our story represents the most successful indigenous liberation movement that ever existed and empowers other indigenous peoples around the world, then all of a sudden I have a problem with it. So it is anti-Semitic because if you apply the same standard to any other people, you would not do it. You're only applying it to the Jewish people.
I have one last question before we wrap this up. I know that this question is going to spark some type of conversation, which might not be the smartest thing to end things on, but I just have to ask and get your guys' opinion on it. There has been a petition going around, which I actually found from Shir's Instagram account. She sent it to me, advocating for the funding of the Iron Dome, the Israel defense, system, whatever it is. People around the world are saying that it's not fair that Israel has the Iron Dome. It's not fair that we are able to protect ourselves and have, the Iron Dome, which if we didn't, we'd be done by now, So what's your guys' take on this petition going around that we have to advocate for this funding of the Iron Dome, let alone the fact that we shouldn't be fighting back or defending ourselves because we have the stronger defense system?
It's insane to me to think that people are trying to defund us, to make sure that we will not be able to defend ourselves. Israel has invested a lot of money in defending its civilians, and that's why not as many Israelis died in this cycle than compared to Palestinians. Every life is precious, and I think that what I'm connecting to everyone that I've heard today, we're talking about how important it is to bring people together and to try and find the humanity in one another. And I think that at some point along the way, we have fed into those type of petitions and this type of rhetoric online that is telling us, choose a side, tell us which side is right and which side is wrong. And we forgot that there's lives that are being impacted by this, not only in Israel, also around the world. And this type of petitions, what they're doing is telling people, it's so smart because it's not even, they know that the Iron Dome is not going to be defunded. America is Israel's ally because of Americans' interests. That's why they're supporting us. It's important to remember that as well. But it's not going to change anything. The only thing that it's going to do is to tell people, that's why not as many Israelis died. And the only way that we can win this PR war is by dying more. And Israeli leaders are not going to allow us to die. And they shouldn't. And we shouldn't apologize for cherishing life. For one of my favorite values of Judaism is pikuach nefesh, and how important human life is. And that's our virtue. And I learned it in my 5 years of service in the army, and I've learned it in working with Palestinians in the field in the West Bank for 5 years, and in doing everything I'm doing. That's what leads me, and what leads me is love for people and for people's life, for my people, but also for Palestinians. And I try to focus on that. This is what leads me in my work, not the hatred, not the anti-Semites, and I think everyone should do that.
So unfortunately, we could honestly go on for so much longer. Do you guys, anybody on Zoom, have any final words, any last sentences you guys want to share with us before we wrap up? Great.
I mean, just to touch base on what Chen was saying, just to wrap it up, it's just so funny to see how people are throwing the word genocide, as if, I mean, don't get me wrong, life is precious, but if the members of the Holocaust knew what they're calling a genocide, they would be offended by it. And people saying that this is what's happening right now in Palestine, there's a genocide happening. Meanwhile, if they want to defund the Iron Dome, a genocide would literally be taking place. And people aren't realizing that. And it kind of is very frustrating, especially seeing people that I know posting things like that.
Right.
It's crazy.
Right.
Also, I mean, Israel is a democracy. It's a government. They're fighting against a terrorist organization with ideology similar to ISIS. So to say because Israel has the technology or the upper hand, or they're fighting a terrorist organization that is out to annihilate them. This is not two governments working on something. Israel has to defend itself against the terrorists. I've been in Israel years ago where there were bus bombings, and it was everyday occurrences back, in 1999, 2000, and you can't reason with terrorists. And America has a strong stance on that, which I support, and I think the world should see it as it is. So, you know, we need to help the Palestinians, but worrying about Hamas and the strength they have is the least issue we have. We should be proud we can defend ourselves against such, you know.
Definitely.
I think we need to understand what terrorism is and how it's a tool. It's usually an anti-colonial tool where you make the price of occupation more expensive than the benefits of exploitation, and eventually that colonial power eventually leaves. The Jews actually did it against the British. We blew up the oil refinery, we blew up hotels, we killed British soldiers, and eventually the British realized, okay, it's not effective to stay here, let's pull out and go back. So that's where Hamas is coming from, and a lot of this Palestinian sentiment on the more extreme side is coming from. Let's make them leave. Let's intifada. Let's shake them off. Let's make them get out of here. But when you use anti-colonial tactics against a native people who just so happens to be 100 times stronger, and no matter what will die on this land, whether through fighting or through old age, it's not going to work, and they're going to respond 100 times stronger. So I think that we need to really get into the depth of conversation so that we understand each other's relationship to this land, which runs deep, and how we can actually move forward from this, because fighting each other is only going to lead to more deaths on both sides, and that's not going to get us anywhere.
Thank you guys so much. I think that, you know, whether you guys are in New York, anywhere in America, anywhere around the world, especially here in Israel, what has happened here in the last 2 weeks, specifically, you know, first time happening so strongly in Tel Aviv, is definitely going to leave a mark on us. We hear the sounds, we hear the sirens, we get triggered. It's very, you know, nerve-wracking and shakes us up and makes us want to influence and educate everyone around us. So I'm really, really, really appreciative of every one of you guys for coming, sharing with your followers, and thank you so much. Obviously, we could have this conversation go on for hours, but unfortunately, that's all the time we have left. Thank you to Moti, Adi, Rudy, Chen, and Shir for joining me, sharing your insight, and for taking part in this essential conversation. And to everyone back home, you can watch the full discussion on our social media later tonight. I'm Emmanuel Kadosh. Stay safe, stay informed, and thank you all for watching.